Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. In 1985, the Nobel Prize in Literature was awarded to Claude Simon, an author associated with the Nouveau Roman movement. Let me read you the citation for his Nobel Prize, who in his novel combines the poet's and the painter's creativeness with a deepened awareness of time in the depiction of the human condition. He was the author of 19 novels, so we have quite a prolific author right here, and his most famous by far is La Route de Flandres, or the Flanders Road, which you can see right here. This is the one that I chose to read back in the day when I started exploring the Nobel Prize winners, but this was not the copy that I used. I used one that was similar to this one, but that doesn't say Nobel Prize 1985 down here. Believe it or not, I had two old copies of this novel. I have no idea why, but you know, I'm kind of strange, so that's the way it happened. But 3 years ago, this one was released by NYRB, so I thought this is a great opportunity for me to reread it, because I like to read different editions of a book, and that's what I decided to do. I have talked about Simon before, so this may be a repeated author for you if you have been watching other videos that I have done. But to be honest with you, I was never entirely satisfied with that video that I did on his novel Histoire. Not because I'm not happy with the views that it has gotten or anything like that, or the reception, or even the friends that I have made thanks to that video. But I don't know, there's something about that video that I felt, oh my gosh, I need to return to Claude Simon and maybe do justice to him a little bit better, at least. So that's why I'm doing this right now. First of all, before we talk about the novel, let me give you a quick overview. What is the Nouveau Roman movement? Okay, now the title unfortunately does not really translate well into English, because we call it the new novel, which is tautological, because as you may know, novel means new, so you have new novel. Same thing happens in Spanish. We say nueva novela. In other languages like French, like Portuguese, like Italian, you don't have that problem, because in those languages they call what we call a novel a romance, right? So that's something that we have to deal with when we talk about this movement in English. And what this movement tried to do was basically to renovate the art of the novel, basically, because the 19th century novel, or the bourgeois novel as it was called, was regarded at this point, when these authors were publishing their work, as obsolete and just not in accordance with the reality of the post-war world, especially in Europe. So the Nouveau Roman basically rethinks the approach to the typical elements of the novel, such as characters, such as story, setting, engagement, you know, politically speaking, and many of those elements of narrative. And what it does is to focus primarily on language. So language is the main thing when it comes to this approach to the novel. The most famous authors of the Nouveau Roman are, of course, Robbe-Grillet, Marguerite Duras, Nathalie Sarraute, Samuel Beckett, very important, Michel Butor, and then of course Claude Simon, who we are talking about right now. If you want a quick overview of this movement, I'm going to tell you many of the authors who belong to it, quote unquote, wrote about it also, and about their poetics and their approach to narrative, or to writing, let's call it that, even better than narrative. The one that I would go for is Robbe-Grillet's For a New Novel, which is a collection of essays. He also talks about other authors involved with the movement. But for example, Nathalie Sarraute, Michel Butor, they also wrote texts about what they saw or what they conceived as the Nouveau Roman. But that's the one that I would recommend to you, because it's the one that I'm most familiar with. So let's talk about the Flanders Road now, okay? This one was published in 1960, and it is Claude Simon's 7th novel. I would describe it, if you asked me, you know, what is it? Like, what is this novel? What is the Flanders Road? I would say that one way to describe it would be as the chronicle of an instant. If I can borrow or steal that title from this great novel by Salvador Elizondo, Farabeuf, or La Crónica de un Instante, that I have told you about before. By the way, many connections between this text and the Nouveau Roman, as I have probably mentioned in that video, but I'm going to link it in the description to this one, just in case you're interested. And in the case of the Flanders Road, the instant in question is the death of a certain Captain de Reichac. This is a guy who was shot off his horse by a German sniper during World War II. And by the way, this is an event that Claude Simon actually witnessed, or a similar event he witnessed when he was a soldier himself. So there is a little bit of a base there in autobiography if you want to look for that kind of connection with this novel. And then after that, you know, after we have that instant right there, this captain being shot off his horse, this novel just emerges as a kind of an exploration of that event from several perspectives, trying to figure out what it was that really happened. Now, if you look at this edition right here, it is 190 pages in length, but the print, I'm going to tell you, is quite small. So really, you're looking at, if you have another edition, you're looking at something like 230 pages or something like that in regular or normal print. And the story, if we may call it that, is divided into three parts. If you explore the work of Claude Simon, you're going to see that he really likes triptychs. And as a matter of fact, one of his novels is titled Triptych, a really, really good one. But we're going to come back to this when we talk about the structure of this text. So before that, let's talk about the characters and also about the story. You know, we're going to put it between quotation marks right there. Our protagonist is a guy by the name of Georges, and he just happens to be a distant relative of this Captain Derechak that I was telling you about before. They are in the same company during the war, and this happened by chance, if you believe in such a thing. So the novel consists primarily of Georges' thoughts about the death of Captain Derechak, and also conversations that he has about this event with Blum, who is a fellow prisoner in a POW camp later on after the war or during the last years of the war. And then also conversations with Corinne, who was Derechak's wife and with whom Georges becomes rather close later on in the story. What other characters do we have here? We have Iglesia, who is a jockey, who was also Derechak's orderly, and he may or may not have had an affair with Corinne, that is, his boss's wife. We also hear about Georges' parents, and also if you look back in history a little bit, we look at an ancestor of Georges, whose name was Reichak. That is the connection with the Reichak right there, with the captain. And this Reichak character, who lived in the 18th century, may or may not have committed suicide. So as you can tell, we have a lot of mays and may nots here when it comes to this text and this quote-unquote story, as we were saying before. In terms of themes, I think obviously, of course, to state the obvious first, the Flanders Road is primarily about war. But this is a war novel unlike any other. Okay, so if you're expecting Hemingway or Remarque or any of that stuff, none of that. Okay, this is completely different. You're not going to see battle sequences or, armies just moving around or any of that stuff that you might expect from a quote-unquote normal war novel. But there is another theme here that is very important, that is like parallel, and that is eroticism. And why do I call it parallel here? Because really, in this novel, eroticism is also presented as a kind of struggle. So you have on the one hand the battle of armies, and on the other the battle of bodies. Very interesting. And all of that is tied together by one main, I would say, leitmotif, which is horses. You're going to see that in this novel we're going to keep coming back to the image of horses. You can tell also there's a, I don't know if you can see it from there, but I'm going to show you the cover anyway. There's a man on a horse here. And if you look at the older edition, this is somewhat closer to the image that we keep coming back to, the main one, which is the carcass of a horse in the mud. So you get that here, recurring, really, one of those recurring images, recurring themes in this text. So now let's talk about structure, which, at least in the context of this novel, I would also call composition or even construction. As I told you before, there are three parts to it. And in an interview, Claude Simon said that he was very careful as to what he put at the beginning, at the end, and also in the middle. The novel, he says, begins and ends with the image of Derechak on his horse. And at the very center, at the midpoint of the text, what we have is the squadron being ambushed and wiped out. So he says we have three images of death right there punctuating the three parts of this novel. And something also very interesting, that I also learned from this interview. I'm going to give you the information in the description to this video just in case you want to check it out. It so happens that in order to keep track of the thematic threads, I don't want to call them narrative threads, but thematic threads what Simon did was to use strips of color that he could visualize. He had them right there in front of him. So that, let's say that, for example, he noticed that one of the colors had not appeared for a while. Then he added a sequence with that theme so that there would be some kind of harmony, in the construction of this text. And what I'm driving at here, based on what Simon said, is that, if you explore the novels of Claude Simon at first, especially if you're coming from a traditional novel or something like that, they may seem chaotic to you, but they are not chaotic at all. There's method to the madness, because there's a kind of a harmony there, a kind of interlacing of themes that he actually used with colors. He did this for at least 3 of his novels. We know that. One is the Flanders Road, the other one is Histoire, and the other one is The Battle of Pharsalus, which were, novels that were published right after each other. So I really like that, the idea that he could visualize the structure, and he used that in order to produce this very harmonious text that looks chaotic to us, but it's only apparently chaotic. Now, since we talked about that directly related, let's share a few ideas on the concept of style. And I think style is huge. If we're going to talk about the Nouveau Roman, style really is primary here. So the characters and the events in this novel are not presented to us in a traditional way, okay? We hear about them little by little as we try to navigate this flood, this torrent of words, because this is one of those novels, okay? It's a torrent of words that threatens to, drown you at times, but it just engulfs us, and we get these pieces of the story as we continue to read. So Simon's style has been compared very aptly to that of William Faulkner. Okay, I think I mentioned that in the previous video that I did, the one that I did on Histoire. And I think this is a good moment, because I do want to mention this, to say that the authors of the Nouveau Roman, even though they are associated with this movement, they are put together in a category or in a group, each one of them has a different approach. And I mean, you just have to read The Flanders Road, then Malloy by Samuel Beckett, and I don't know, The Erasers by Alain Robbe-Grillet, The Erasers right here, in order to tell, and to see what it is that I'm telling you, that each one of them has a different poetics and a different approach, even though they are all grouped because of some things that they do have in common. So we could think about it this way. The traditional novel gives us information in a linear way. Then we could move on to the modernist novel that kind of gives us pieces of the puzzle, and then we put together those pieces and we can see the total image. As Godard said, for example, yes, a story has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order. And that's what I would say is the case with the modernist novel. But then if we take that a little bit further, when we come to the Nouveau Roman, what happens is that, just like in the modernist novel, we are given the pieces, we put them together, and then when we put them together, we still have no idea what's going on. And I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but you know what I'm saying, right? It's still very difficult to see very clearly the picture, For the Nouveau Roman, the author, right, or the narrator, is not some godlike figure, or not even some kind of a, moralist or a didactic figure or anything like that, but he or she is primarily a maker. And here we go back to the original meaning of poetry, the word in Greek, piesis, which means to make, right, to create. Hence that title by Borges, the maker, el hacedor. We're going back to that original meaning. And I like here something that I read about Simon, I believe in the same interview that I have been talking about before, when he was trying to explain his poetics. And he borrowed something that Paul Valéry said, also trying to explain or to clarify his poetics. He said, I don't have something to say. My concern is primarily with making something. It's very interesting. And making, of course, referring to poetry, right? The original word. And there's another thing that I thought very interesting that he says. He says that in his books, he doesn't really have description. He doesn't describe, but he just writes. Okay, and there's a play with words here that is lost in translation, because in French you have the word or the verb écrire, to write, and then décrire, which is to describe. In Spanish it's the same thing. We say escribir and describir. In English, we have a Latin term on the one hand and a more Germanic one on the other, so the play with words is lost. But you could say there's a difference between, I don't know, script and description, if that works, if that clarifies things. I mean, naturally, you know, as human beings, we want to try to understand. We always seek to elucidate, you know, but unfortunately, as you know, in life, sometimes we just don't get the answers. You know, we don't get the answers no matter how many questions we ask and from how many different perspectives we approach a thing. You know, sometimes it's just not that easy and it's not that clear. And that is precisely what a novel like The Flanders Road and many others of the Nouveau Roman or novels by Claude Simon are trying to illustrate. Is precisely this idea right here. So one question that may arise is, okay, would you say then that this is a nihilistic novel? Is it a defeatist novel? Or why read something like this, you know? I would say that no, I definitely do not think that The Flanders Road or anything that Claude Simon wrote is nihilistic. What this novel points to is just the primacy of language. You know, the Nouveau Roman, generally speaking, at the end of the day, what it's trying to say is that at the end of the day, when you subtract everything else, what remains is language. That is the main thing. You know, as they say, one of the characters in one of the movies by Godard, language is the house where human beings live. And that's basically, you know, a great poetic line for the Nouveau Roman. Simon and company are saying that the traditional approach to narration, right, to the novel, is no longer adequate to explore or to narrate the reality of the late 20th century world. As a matter of fact, we could even say that according to them, it is impossible to narrate really this type of reality. That's why they tend to approach their novels in a non-narrative way, or at least in a different way of narrating. Let me share something with you that Simon said in that interview that has to do directly with this. He says, literature, which has traditionally projected a coherent view of the world, is now grappling with its fragmented form. And like the modern painter, the modern writer is reassembling the pieces in a new order. Okay, so the novel really includes a very good comment on this, because we hear about Georges' father, okay? And Georges' father laments the destruction of the Leipzig library during World War II. And you know what Georges' response is to that? He says, well, if all of those books that were in that wonderful library could do nothing to prevent their own destruction and what cost it, you know, the war and all that comes with it, then what good are those books? All of those traditional books, okay? So that's his response. It's the response of the character, okay, within the novel. Now, before I share with you some criticism and also just the bottom line to this video, I wanted to quickly touch upon one issue that I think is important, and that is the legacy of the Nouveau Roman as a movement, you know. Because as far as Simon and the Nouveau Roman authors are concerned, the traditional novel, the kind of novel precisely that fills these libraries, is just dead, okay? And I was reminded of something that I heard in an interview with Roberto Bolaño. He said something very similar, virtually the same thing, I would say. He said, the linear novel is just done to death. But, he added, that doesn't mean that linear novels are not going to continue to be published, okay? And as a matter of fact, you know, when you look around and you look at, you know, judging just by what is released, what is published, I think that the general reader, you know, basically speaking generally here, the general reader, the general film goer, is just incredibly conservative in his or her tastes, right? I mean, it's the same old formulas that continue to be done and redone. So I think that in the end, speaking of the legacy of the Nouveau Roman, and, you know, as tends to happen with the avant-garde and experimental movements, the Nouveau Roman did not really kill the traditional novel, like not at all. What happened also is that many authors adopted techniques from the Nouveau Roman and they used them in novels that are more accessible to the general reader. And that's what tends to happen with all of these avant-garde and experimental movements. So I just wanted to share those 2 cents on that. Now, I promised some criticism, okay, so we can go a little bit deeper with this. I read an essay by, let me give you the correct information, by Gerald Prince, titled How to Redo Things in Words. I really like the title there, especially in the context here of Claude Simon. So let me share with you some thoughts from there. The first one has to do with history, a very important topic for Simon. As a matter of fact, as I said before, one of his novels is titled Histoire. Okay, so this is what Prince says, Gerald Prince, okay, not the musician. Written history, which serves victorious nations, pedigreed families, and disinfected textbooks, seems incapable of capturing the individual, the unique, the real. Based on such bankrupt notions as continuity, order, rationality, and progress, notions belied by the Flanders debacle, history overlooks accidents and suppresses contradictions. It favors simple explanations and tidy patterns, conventional motivations, and well-worn scripts. It adopts the tricks of narrative, sacrificing accuracy for tellability and facts for effects. So as I said in the other video, history, like histoire in French, means history, but it also means story. So the implication here is that history is just another story. Not false, okay, not really false, but not absolute truth either. It's just one version of events, one perspective. The next one that I wanted to share with you has to do with knowledge, okay? And it says right here, Prince says, what La Route de Flandre puts into question is not so much the reality or singularity of situations and events as their semiotic autonomy and their acontextual totalization. What it underlines is not the inanity of knowledge, but its limits and limitations. And that would go with what I said before, that I don't believe this is a nihilistic novel. All that it's saying is, or one of the things that it's saying is, hey, yeah, it's possible to know things, but be aware that our knowledge has some huge limitations. And then finally, the other one that I wanted to share with you has to do with language, which I think is really important in this case. It's central to what we are talking about. Language can, in fact, be useful. By allowing for the construction of an indefinite number of possible worlds, it can help to illuminate one or more aspects of our ever-changing reality, and even to prepare us for new states of affairs in that reality. Language, through its magic, can also help us to escape intolerable situations or to make them more palatable. So let me share with you then some thoughts about the movie adaptation. Just kidding, there is no movie adaptation. I would actually be very interested in seeing a film adaptation of the Flanders Road. So if anybody's listening and they want to take up that challenge, please do. Bottom line, if you want to read Claude Simon, I would say definitely start with the Flanders Road, okay? Just let the language take over and carry you, okay? Be like a cat when they get the zoomies, okay? That's pretty much what you have to do when you read this novel. Just let it happen. I personally liked it so much that I continued to read Claude Simon, and at this point I have read 10 of his novels, so basically a little bit over half of them, and I do of course plan to read the others. And let me tell you what I did, which is what I recommend that you do if you're interested in exploring more by Claude Simon. After reading The Flanders Road, I went chronologically with the others, but starting with The Wind. Okay, the previous 4 novels are kind of unofficial / repudiated, they're not part of his collected works as they were published by the Bibliothèque de la Pléiade, so it's kind of like he left them aside, like Bioy Casares did with his first books, and Borges tried to do, he was going to get rid of those 3 first books or something like that, but fortunately for us, somebody did not follow the instructions, so we have access to them. But yeah, I would say do that. Begin with The Flanders Road and then start with The Wind and kind of move forward with the other novels. I have had a lot of fun with this author, and I plan to read at least the ones that are available in English translation, because those first 4 unfortunately are not available, and I don't know if my French is good enough for experimental fiction like this one. I think I would probably get lost. I find it a bit of a challenge to read it in English, to be honest with you, but it's a good challenge. I want to share with you at some point my Claude Simon collection, because I have all of his books except one in English or in Spanish. So I should probably get a copy of that one in French or something like that. The English and the Spanish for that one are just very difficult to find. It's very expensive. So I'm going to see if I can find it. And if not, I'll just share with you the others. So stay tuned if you're interested in more on Claude Simon, because I really, really love this author. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. Those were my 2 cents on La Route de Flandre, The Flanders Road by Claude Simon. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.